Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our Monday edition of Point of View, and over the next hour, we're going to spend some time looking at statues. We're going to look at the burning down of some churches, conflict in Portland that has now resulted in the Department of Homeland Security sending in troops, which has now made it controversial. 50 days of riots and protests, no, not even worth mention in the news. As soon as, of course, federal troops go in, now, of course, everybody is wringing their hands about what is taking place there. So we'll get into some of those issues. The first article I'll look at comes from Kay Cole James, who is the head of the Heritage Foundation. A little bit later, we're going to look at a couple of things in terms of the pandemic. Scientists now have identified about 6 different types of coronavirus, some which are more virulent than others. And then some news about not only one vaccine that we've talked about before, Moderna, which is out of the Boston area, but now AstraZeneca, which is out of England, tied into Oxford University. So there maybe is hope on the horizon for that. We'll get into the whole question while we're talking about the pandemic of is it time to send the kids back to school? Over the last weekend here, we've had all sorts of individuals now weighing in, saying that if we really do, quote, trust the science, this is certainly something that can and should be done, given the fact that very significant number of schools in Europe and in Australia and other places are in session now. To keep the kids out is going to do great harm. So we have a lot to cover just in this 1 hour. I don't know if I'll get to all of it, but then the next hour, Jeanne Allen will be with us. We'll be talking about parental rights in light of the Supreme Court decision, the Espinoza case out of Montana, dealing with the Blaine Amendment and a number of other issues. Then after about a half an hour of that interview, we'll be talking with Michael Neal, who has filed a number of briefs talking about vote by mail and voter fraud. So he's become quite the expert. Some of those amicus briefs have been with Pennsylvania, California, even with the Supreme Court. So we'll try to get a handle on that. And then if you do want to join us for the third hour, we'll get back into some of these issues that we've been discussing here and spend the last half hour with our good friend, Dr. Paul Barreca, director of the Fellowship International Mission. Can talk a little bit about what's going on in the mission field, talk also about this issue of social gospel and the real gospel and social action and a number of other topics. So there is a lot to cover over the next couple of hours, and I hope you'll join us for as much of the program as you possibly can do. Let me go to the first article that you can find on our website, pointofview.net. And Kay Cole James, of course, is an individual that has served in the Reagan administration. She is the president of the Heritage Foundation, and she begins her column by saying, I'm going to get straight to the point. It's time for bold action. It's time for Americans everywhere who love their country to heed the words of President Ronald Reagan. If we lose freedom here, then there's no place to escape. This is the last stand on earth. And she goes into talking about how we have all these violent mobs that have defaced and torn down statues across the country in the name of social justice. And you've heard me rattle off the short list. Matter of fact, somebody produced a list, and I think there were like 65 on that list, but we're talking about George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, Winston Churchill, Gandhi, Cervantes, Voltaire. The list goes on and on. Even the guitarist Stevie Ray Vaughan, even tearing down abolitionists like Matthias Baldwin, former slave and abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. I mean, it makes no sense anymore. And that's the point she's saying, is that memorials to founding fathers George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, even the statue of Union heroes like Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, and she counts up 150 statues and memorials nationwide have been destroyed, defaced, or taken down during the last month and a half of protest. So she says it's become clear that it matters little to the Marxists and anarchists what a statue or monument represents. You think? I mean, we're starting to see them tearing down just anything. We'll get into that in just a minute when we talk about even statues of the Virgin Mary and Jesus and everything else getting torn down as well. And, of course, all that matters to them, she says, is that it represents America's past and therefore must come down. She said it's also clear that they're not interested in resolving race issues. Destroying monuments, burning churches, looting businesses do nothing to bring attention to racism or to advance police reforms. They're simply using racial discontent to forward their Marxist agenda. As a matter of fact, how have we seen any kind of response? And I love this one. After rioters in Baltimore recently tore down a statue of Christopher Columbus and tossed it in the harbor, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, a Baltimore native, by the way, her family used to be there, blithely excused the behavior, telling reporters, well, people will do what people will do. And, of course, you might wonder why that is the case. Well, if indeed you want votes, even if you disagree with some of the things that the hard left does, even if you're a liberal, you need their votes, so you're not going to say anything about it. And so that's not going to come from that side of the aisle. But again, Kay Cole James puts it this way. We've built statues and memorials to recognize individuals and events representing some of the noblest and even some of the worst moments in our history. The people memorialized didn't lead perfect lives. Many did controversial, even evil things, but monuments help tell our history, help us remember our highest ideals, as well as the mistakes we've made and wish not to repeat again. But her concluding comments are this. If politicians ignore or even tacitly encourage these mobs, they will declare more and more things offensive until they've targeted every founding father, which I think is kind of the case. Every religious institution, she points out some are even calling for the removal of images of Jesus, and virtually any symbol of, quote, oppressive Western civilization. So she said, we must put an end to this now. The rioters and statue topplers must be arrested and prosecuted. By the way, many are. We must educate the public about the truth of the founding of the most exceptional nation on earth, and we must wrest our educational system from the hands of leftists who use our schools as indoctrination centers before we lose yet another generation to them. Her concluding points are, this must be our wake-up call because, as Ronald Reagan also admonished, freedom must be fought for, protected, and handed on to our children to do the same, or one day we'll be telling our children's children what it was once like in the United States when people were free. Again, she's African-American, as if that matters, but again, I think it was helpful that after originally saying some things that seemed very supportive of the obviously protest about George Floyd, she came back to make some comments about this as well. Over the next segment or so, you're going to probably say to yourself, why am I only hearing about this on Point of View? Because we're going to talk about, first of all, the churches that have been burned, and you probably have not heard about that. Matter of fact, I had somebody that's in my Sunday school class say the only reason I knew about some of these churches being burned is because I read Jim Dennison's daily article. And then we have heard hardly anything about now what has become 50 days of protest and riots in Portland. But only now we're hearing about it because, after all, the federal government decided to send in some people with the Department of Homeland Security to do what apparently the police in Portland are not willing to do. And I'll try to give you both sides on that because I can understand why some are concerned about what is happening, but you also understand why the federal government felt like it had to get involved. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A dead cat in Atlanta, Georgia was sent a voter registration form in the mail. That is unfortunate since only live dogs and cats should be registered to vote. I'm joking, but just barely. One journalist has documented that pets, some named Mozart and Scampers, have been receiving voter applications in Florida, Colorado, and Washington State. This is not a new phenomenon. Years ago, I had a commentary about all the false names used to register voters in a number of states. For example, the names of the entire starting line of the Dallas Cowboys was used to register people to vote in Nevada. And the addresses used in some of these fraudulent forms have been traced to restaurants and vacant lots. Now, the Georgia Secretary of State said that the voter application for Cody the cat did not come from their office. Third-party groups often use mailing lists to get names and addresses. But you can imagine what the cat's owner, Ron Timms, thought when he checked his mailbox and found a registration card for Cody Timms. He was a great cat and lived more than 18 years, but he did not need to register to vote, especially since he passed away some time ago. Obviously, I'm having some fun here, but the issue is serious. Mail-in ballots, along with massive voter registration mailings, have all the potential for misuse and abuse. Any person could take the voter registration application for the dead cat and fill it out with the necessary information. And when stacks of voter registration applications are dumped on the desk of local officials, they simply don't have the time to check all the names and addresses. Whoever decides to become Cody Timms could then show up with a voter registration card or even ask for a mail-in ballot. The next time someone tells you that voter fraud is a myth and that mail-in ballot elections are safe, just remember this story of a dead cat receiving a voter registration form. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Did you know the churches were being attacked across the country? Probably not if you watch the mainstream media. And Tony Perkins has done us a favor in the Daily Signal just the other day. He talked about what happened last weekend, and that's the weekend before, because this latest weekend we could add some more, but I'll just use his because it's still very relevant. And he points out that over the weekend, that would be the one before, rioters, the same ones who wanted us to believe their cause is justice, came for our churches using gasoline lighters, gallons of paint, and vans to drive their message of destruction and chaos through the heart of America's faithful. I'll just give you the tip of the iceberg because there's a lot. He talks about the fact that it took more than 50 firefighters to put out a mountain of flames at San Gabriel Church, which by Saturday night was nothing but a rickety frame of smoldering ash. And then goes through some of the quotes there, so I'll jump on to the next one. He says, while Californians watched helplessly as a town symbol burned, congregants in Florida's Queen of Peace Catholic Church were praying in the sanctuary when they heard a car crash through the foyer. Seconds later came the smell of smoke filling and clouding the entry. So that was another attack that took place in Florida, one in California and one in Florida. We'll get to some others in just a minute. But I thought this was interesting because later the police actually caught at least one 23-year-old arsonist who said he was on a mission. Turns out it was a mission several radicals shared as a wave of destruction hit as many as 5 more churches in 48 hours. Even the historically black congregations were targets. One example of that would be Calvary Baptist in San Diego, as it watched its building for children's ministry burn to the ground after a suspicious blaze started in the attic. At the same time, you can go to then like New York City, where mobs made bonfires out of 2 Virgin Mary statues with words like idol scrawled in ugly black paint on them. And then, of course, you had just the other day, one I think we mentioned on the air here, there was a sculpture of Jesus that was decapitated. You can see that one for yourself. It's made its way onto Facebook quite a number of times. And so Tony Perkins at the end says, well, if you want to know why the mainstream media isn't covering these attacks, and many have wondered, it's no secret, he says they don't want to expose this movement for what it is, a sham of racial equality and a revolt against the rule of law rooted in the transcendent truth of God. Once the foundation for government is gone, these zealots are coming for it. It's only a matter of time before America is hollowed out shell ready for transformation. So he goes on to talk about these attacks on the churches. And if nothing else, I wanted to cover it simply because the mainstream press doesn't seem to be covering it. Let's get to Portland. You know, we almost talked about Portland on Friday, but there was no reason, even though at that time there had been 47 straight days of rioting and protest. And now it's in the news because, after all, when it was becoming more obvious that, for example, the Multnomah County Sheriff's Department and the Portland Police couldn't quell what was taking place, and since most of these attacks were against federal buildings, the president and the Secretary of Homeland Security said, well, we have to do something to protect federal buildings. And so they sent in a number of individuals, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But I thought, let's again do what the mainstream press does not do, and that is give you some context. And I'm only going to read some of the highlights, but back on May 29th, this is a few days after, of course, the controversy, which is legitimate, and the protest over the death of George Floyd, rioters broke out the front window and painted graffiti over the Mark Hatfield Courthouse on 3rd Avenue in Portland, causing $5,000 worth of damage. The next day, demonstrators, many apparently identifying with Black Lives Matter, although Antifa is also involved with this as well, defaced several other buildings with graffiti, including, of course, the Hatfield Courthouse and the Edith Green Wendell Riot Federal Building, also on 3rd Avenue. Over the next couple of days, vandals spray painted these 2 federal buildings along with numerous others. On June 6, rioters destroyed fencing around the federal property. Next day, they breached the fence. They broke more windows, cut a hole in the fence. 2 days later, they removed the entire fence around the federal building. June 11th, rioters dismantled the fence around the Green Wyatt building. Several more acts of violence, including graffiti. June 20th, saw a crowd now of 400 using commercial-grade lasers to try to cause eye damage to the police officers by actually pointing them in the eyes of the police officers. June 30th, rioters ripped off plywood covering the windows of the Green Wyatt building, proceeded to break more windows in the 2 federal buildings. On July 2nd, rioters refused to vacate an area of the Hatfield Courthouse. They launched fireworks through objects at the police. By the way, if you'd like to know what those are, I've got a picture here that was actually on the Twitter post of the Multnomah County Sheriff. We're talking bricks, glass bottles, blades, ball bearings, mortars, batteries. You know, they always say, oh, we were just selling some water bottles. No, they're not. Right, we got the evidence right here, but let me continue because it gets worse. The next night, the rioters broke more windows, fired more fireworks, used lasers again, trying to create eye damage to the various police. And then you come up to July 7th. By the way, it is July 20th today, so you can see I'm just giving you what happened 2 weeks ago. You had what was called the Night of Rage, and this is where about 200 participants pursued officers, assaulted them with rocks and bottles. And then you had, on July 8th, about 200 attacked officers as well. And this now meant they were attacking the Department of Homeland Security law enforcement. Hence, then, the decision by the Department of Homeland Security to try to protect these federal buildings and to push back. And so now you see some of the arguments being made that are saying this was going too far. But let me at least quote from the acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, who said, "The Department of Homeland Security is answering the president's call to use our law enforcement personnel across the county and across the country to protect our historic landmarks. We won't sit idly by while violent anarchists and rioters seek to not only vandalize and destroy the symbols of our nation, but to disrupt law and order and sow chaos in our areas." This, of course, once they showed up, actually began to find individuals that they were looking for. My theory is this: they probably already have facial recognition software and are looking for particular individuals. They will pull up in rented cars because they're unmarked, and they come out with camouflage on that does say police, but the argument is that this is like some kind of banana republic where we're taking people off the streets and kidnapping them. No, not actually. We're going after those individuals they've already identified as some of the ringleaders, some of the anarchists and others. And so as a result, they go and take them to a facility, question them, read them their Miranda rights. Sometimes when it turns out they can't give any more information, they let them back on the streets. But as you might imagine, you have Senators Jeff Merkley and Ron Wyden, Representative Earl Blumenauer, as well as, of course, the governor of the state of Oregon and the mayor of Portland, all deploying the tactics being used by federal officers. There's going to be an attempt over the next few days to even add an amendment to the defense authorization bill simply because they want to have this stop. But as I've said before, back then when the city of Portland was under siege for 47 straight days, you heard nothing about it in the media. As soon as the Department of Homeland Security shows up, oh, now we got a crisis. And the crisis was simply a crisis that was created because law enforcement simply could not contain and control what is taking place. I would encourage you, don't take my word for it, just type Portland right now, maybe type Portland riots, Portland protests, and look at some of the buildings. It looks like something out of a third world country. Looks like something that had been taken over by anarchists who are destroying federal property. And I guess the question you certainly have to ask yourself every once in a while is, how much longer do we actually turn the other cheek, if you will? It's gotten worse in Chicago. Over the weekend, 18 police officers injured after Chicago protesters hurled hundreds of projectiles at them. And so these individuals are getting hurt even more so than some of those that were there in Portland. This is the state of affairs, and I think it's best illustrated by the fact I watched an ABC News story the other day that said the protests have been generally peaceful. Yeah, go look at the pictures and tell me if that's generally peaceful. And you can see that maybe we're not getting the full story. That's why I hope, if nothing else, you continue to listen to Point of View. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to get into the whole question of whether or not our kids could go to school, but I thought I did leave a few things maybe hanging from that previous commentary, and that is when the decision was made to send the Department of Homeland Security, they decided that they would not come in federal vehicles. Does that make some sense? I think you can see why that would be the case. If you show up in a federal vehicle, what's going to happen? The protesters are going to throw all sorts of rocks and ball bearings and take baseball bats to it. So that's not going to work very well. If you show up in a uniform, you can imagine what would happen there as well. It's one of the reasons why we do have police in unmarked police cars in plain clothes. We have done this for many years. Now, New York City recently said, no, we're going to get rid of the plain clothes police officers. But of course, if you pull up in a police car or you pull up in a federal car, first of all, that's going to scatter individuals. So I can understand why on some cases our friends at the ACLU and civil libertarians said, wait a minute, this is looking a little too much like going out and kidnapping individuals, and you aren't necessarily wearing a badge. Well, a lot of people would wonder who you are, so I think I can see their point of view. But I can certainly see the point of view from the federal government. After 50 straight days of attacks on federal buildings, you're not going to come out there with your uniform on and then risk being hurt because of this. You might say, well, then how are they pulling them off the street? You have to have probable cause, right? Well, they wait till after curfew, so they've already violated curfew. They already have, in some cases, individuals that they are suspecting are the ringleaders, and they then simply put these plastic handcuffs on them. You've seen those little ties that they use. Put them in a car, drive them, interrogate them, and make their decisions from there. So I can see both sides of this, but at the same time, how much more are we going to just simply allow the rioting and protesting to take place when indeed we are destroying through various kinds of actions, various monuments, various kinds of statues, federal buildings, and the rest. And so it's just something to pay attention to because it's not being covered right now in the mainstream press. And, of course, it isn't because if indeed people really understood what was happening, then the reaction that many people have had to President Trump wanting to bring law and order probably would switch the other way. Here's one more example. This comes from Black Lives Matter, who went into a Target store the other day. This one actually was in, if I remember right, in the Columbia Heights neighborhood. And here is a person with a bullhorn demanding that Target no longer call the police when shoplifters who are African American actually are in the stores. So again, maybe white shoplifters can have the police called, but not black shoplifters. And if you think I'm making this stuff up, the sad reality is, I think some of you listening to the things I've been talking about over the last maybe 20 minutes say, you must be making this up because I haven't seen ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC cover any of this. Frankly, I haven't even seen Fox News cover much of this. And yet this is what's going on, and it's just a reminder again of what is happening in other parts of the country. So since so many of you live in Dallas, you might say, well, it's sad that it's happening in Chicago. It's sad that it's happening in Washington, D.C. It's sad that it's happening in Seattle and Portland, but it wouldn't happen here. And again, the mainstream press, even the Dallas press, did not cover the fact that a Black Lives Matter group came into a restaurant downtown Dallas the other day and disrupted all of that. And the only reason we know it is because one of the African-American diners pulled out his phone and videotaped it and said, this is exactly why I have questions about the Black Lives Matter movement, because they came here and disrupted this restaurant for reasons known only to them and made everything very, very tense around the tables, most of which were outside, while Black Lives Matter showed up there. So it may not necessarily be happening quite as frequently in a place like Dallas or Tupelo, Mississippi, or even Augusta, Georgia. But you know what? It might be happening even there as well. So just, again, some points to help you understand some of the things that are just simply not being covered right now by the media. And if that's not media malpractice, I don't know what is. Let's get to another issue, and that is we've posted a very good piece or two about just the idea of the school reopenings. And I'm going to get to the one that we've posted by Katie Pavlich, but I thought that Michael Reagan, who was the adopted son of Ronald Reagan, started his column with 3 questions. See if you could agree with these questions. Number 1, can we all agree that the kids living in the biggest cities don't get a good education? Yeah, I think we could agree with that. That one's easily documented. Number 2, can we all agree that it's a travesty that upward of 95% of the kids in our inner city schools aren't able to read, write, or count at the grade level? And again, I've given you some facts and figures on that. So number 3, he says, can we all agree that if we don't open our schools this fall, we will hurt the most, the ones that we will hurt the most are the poor kids of every color in our inner cities? And I think we could agree with that too, because as he points out a little bit later in his piece here, the elites that are in Manhattan, or they're in Washington, or they're in Beverly Hills, or they're in the affluent neighborhoods. These are people with lots of money. They can send their kids to private school. They can hire tutors. They can homeschool their kids. Plus, these kids have computers. They have whiteboards. They have really all that they need to educate their kids. Is that what you find in the poor communities? Of course not. And again, Michael Reagan says, despite evidence from Germany and everywhere, pretty much in Europe, that children are virtually immune to COVID-19 and rarely, if ever, spread the virus to adults. They tend to be a break on it, is the technical term there. Some teachers and administrators say they want to skip school this fall because they're worried about the health of their kids. But the other argument is that the teachers are afraid of their own health. And he said, okay, if you're over the age of 60 or you're saddled with several medical preconditions, okay, maybe we need to deal with that in a separate way. But to say that we're not going to allow the kids to actually go to school is a travesty, which brings me to this piece that we have posted by Katie Pavlich. I think Michael Reagan's argument was good. Katie's is even better because what she does is she quotes from the experts. What do the experts have to say? On Friday, I talked about the interview on this one program, and I erroneously said it was CNN. It turned out it was NBC, but it was, again, where they were doing interviews with these leading pediatricians around the country. Every one of them said, I've got kids, I'm sending them to school. And then you come back to the host who's like, didn't expect those kind of answers from them. But let's go to the American Academy of Pediatrics. Here's their statement. The importance of in-person learning is well documented, and there is already evidence of the negative impacts on children because of school closures in the spring of 2020. We've talked about these in the program. Lengthy time away from school and associated interruption of supportive services also results in social isolation, making it difficult for students and schools to identify and address important learning deficits, as well as children and adolescent physical and sexual abuse, substance abuse, depression, and suicidal isolation. This in turn places children and adolescents at considerable risk of morbidity and in some cases mortality. Beyond the educational impact and social impact of school closures, there has been the substantial impact on food security and physical activity for children and families. The National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine said weighing the health risk of reopening K-12 schools in fall 2020 goes against the educational risk of providing no in-person instruction. School districts should prioritize reopening schools full-time, especially for K-5 and students with special needs, according to a new report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. She goes on to give us some other quotes as well. But finally, when you have this real powerful argument for opening the schools, she reminds us that the United Teachers Los Angeles Union announced on Friday that the Los Angeles Unified District schools effectively cannot reopen unless certain conditions are met. What are those? Privately operating, publicly funded charter schools are shut down. Police are defunded. Medicare for all government-run health care is passed. A statewide health and wealth tax is implemented. Housing for homeless is fully funded. Financial support for undocumented students and family. And they want a federal bailout because the CARES and HEROES Act provided funding for K-12 fell short of what they felt they needed for their district. So they will open the schools if we get Medicare for all, we defund the police, we get rid of charter schools, and we pass this particular piece of legislation being considered by Congress. with a few more $1 trillion added to it as well. That's not exactly looking out for the welfare of the students, is it? Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention that in about 15 minutes, we're going to have Jeanne Allen with us as we talk about parents' rights. I think you'll appreciate that. Michael O'Neill will be talking about this idea of vote by mail and voter fraud. And that really brings me to my next point. And who knew that Elizabeth Warren was such a comedian? The other day, Senator Elizabeth Warren announced that her dog Bailey is definitely going to vote in November. And Warren said Bailey is voting Democrat all the way. Bailey for Biden. What I think is so interesting is Bronson Stocking said, for the record, Warren never said she was joking. Let's hope Warren is less serious about her dog being a registered Democrat than she was about her being an American Indian. But it relates to my Viewpoints commentary today, where I tell you the story of a dead cat in Atlanta, Georgia, that was actually sent a voter registration form in the mail. And having a little bit of fun with that, I said, now that's not fair because only live dogs and cats should be allowed to vote. And if you think that's a joke, you then have to look at the one journalist that's documented that pets, some named Mozart and Scampers, have actually received voter applications in Florida, Colorado, Washington State. You can go through the list. And as I pointed out, this is not a new phenomenon. We have been talking about this for years. And, of course, the Georgia Secretary of State said the voter application for Cody the cat did not come from their office, and most likely these third-party groups use mailing lists to get names and addresses. But you can kind of imagine the cat's owner, Ron Timms, thought when he opens up the mailbox there and found a registration card for Cody Timms. He said he was a great cat, and he lived for 18 years, but he didn't need to register to vote since he passed away some time ago. And you can see how this can lead almost immediately to the conversation we're going to have with Michael O'Neill. Somebody finding that application could just fill it out and then become Cody Timms, then show up with a voter registration card or even ask for a mail-in ballot. Now, you might say, well, no, they would catch that. No, they wouldn't, because they don't actually look through those. Many times these stacks and stacks of voter registration applications are dumped on the desk of the local officials just a few days before. They simply don't have the time or sometimes even the inclination to check. And so you can see where this actually can lead. So my commentary today is about the voter registration for a dead cat, but it also relates very much to the conversation we're going to have with Michael O'Neill at about 1:30, because he has been following this for some time and had filed a number of briefs in various courts about this issue of vote by mail and voter fraud. Just before we take a break, though, let's see if we can address a few other issues, and I guess it's time for some encouraging news. We are seeing some tremendous advances in these vaccines. Just the other day, I talked about Moderna. Moderna is out of Boston. It's developed what you might call an RNA vaccine, and the results, which were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, show that the vaccine induced the desired immune response in all 45 people that were evaluated. So now a larger group of hundreds will actually be going through this. But they found that, first of all, the vaccine is generally safe, well tolerated, and did generate the immune response. So that's what we can call sort of an RNA vaccine. There's a second one that we have in the news right now, and that's what's called a viral vaccine. That one comes out of Oxford University and is tied to AstraZeneca. This one is where, again, it was administered in a trial that involved about 1,000 people and caused a immune response in people aged 18 to 55 that lasted for 2 months or slightly longer. Then this was data that appeared in the medical journal Lancet. So that's kind of the latest today. So we have already a couple of different kinds. Normally, as we've pointed out before, it can take up to 10 years to develop a vaccine. The hope is that this would be ready by the end of the year or early in 2021. And so what they are doing is racing through these in ways that maybe have never been done before. Phase 1, of course, looks at the safety and the immune response. Phase 2 looks at sort of a randomized study and trial looking at hundreds of participants. And then Phase 3, which might actually be just the rollout, looks at the safety and efficacy with thousands of individuals. But in order to kind of speed this up, what they have decided to do is do animal and human tests simultaneously rather than sequentially, and have decided that they might even start mass producing the vaccines even before they know they work. If they're not effective, then the stockpile would be destroyed. If they are, then they would be applied to the individuals. So if nothing else, we're starting to see how that is unfolding pretty quickly. But the question that still is on the table is this: how many people actually would indeed be willing to be vaccinated? A recent poll indicated only about half the country will take the vaccine when produced. That might be enough, by the way, to actually produce what's called herd immunity, especially given the fact that herd immunity may be a lower level than we thought. It used to be assumed to be at 70%. I gave you some facts and figures the other day that said it could be at 20%, that we may even be approaching it in some places where more people actually did get the virus, the coronavirus, but had very few symptoms or no symptoms. And so we may be closer. But of course, in the back of everybody's mind is, when you go this fast, is there ever the possibility of being a mistake? And my commentary on June 17th was an attempt to remind you that just a few years ago, the Rush campaign to vaccinate children in the Philippines at the time was stopped because of safety reasons. And even in this country, go back to 1976, President Gerald Ford rushed the swine flu vaccine program, and a number of Americans developed a very rare disorder with the body's immune system attacking the nerves. By the way, we had one of the Dallas Cowboys that has that particular disease as well. So there are some really significant questions that people are asking right now. But if nothing else, with that success also is something else that we're learning, and that is, it turns out that there are 6 different types of the coronavirus. 6 different types, some which are more virulent than others. And so the scientists at King's College in London found that patients with the 6th type of COVID-19 are nearly 10 times more likely to end up needing breathing support than patients in the first group. So you go through 1 through 6. If you get this type number 1, probably aren't going to suffer very much, may not even generate much of an immune response. If you get number 6, you are much more likely to need some kind of help with breathing and going into ICU. So we are recognizing that although there is a coronavirus out there, there are really 6 different types. And in some cases, individuals are only experiencing limited symptoms. In other cases, it becomes quite severe. So as we go on, we learn more about the science every single day. And let's, if we can, now take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about this issue of parental rights. This is something the Supreme Court has underscored, and we'll talk about that with Jeanne Allen, who is the founder and chief executive of the Center for Education Reform. Then a little bit later, we'll talk with Michael O'Neill, Assistant General Counsel, and an individual that has been working in this area for some time and expressing very real concerns about voter fraud that can happen through some of these vote-by-mail schemes. So we'll be talking about that with those individuals, and then a little bit later, Dr. Paul Barreca will join us in the 3rd hour. All that coming up right after this.
"2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and we're going to be talking, first of all, about this very important issue of parental rights, the Espinoza case out of the Supreme Court, and we talked about a little of that in the past, and the Blaine Amendment are certainly some things that we're going to get into, and some of the benefits that come from this particular ruling. A little bit later this hour, we're going to get into the subject of voting by mail and the potential for voter fraud. Michael O'Neill will be with us. We'll be talking about that issue. It relates a little bit even to my commentary today, talking about how a dead cat received a voter registration form, and we'll get into some of the questions about mail-in fraud and the rest. So those are some conversations we'll have this hour. Next hour, we'll get into some of the issues in the news. We have this piece by Kay Cole James about the toppling of statues. We'll talk about what's been taking place in Portland, which has not been in the news until, of course, when the Department of Homeland Security decides, maybe it is about time to defend federal buildings. They come in there as well. Talk about some of the churches that have been burned down that maybe, again, the mainstream press has not covered. And before the next hour is over, we'll spend some time with our good friend, Dr. Paul Barreca, talking about what's happening in missions and talking about the social gospel, social justice warriors, all sorts of topics that we will get into, which I think you will appreciate as well. Jeanne Allen is with us. She is the founder and chief executive of the Center for Education Reform. Perhaps you have seen her school reform handbook, How to Improve Your Schools. Individual who started her career on Capitol Hill and was a senior official in the Department of Education, holds a master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and writes a column for Forbes, also hosts a podcast, Reality Check with Jeanne Allen, and it is great to have you on the program with us today.
It's so nice to be with you, Kerby. Thank you.
Let's talk about this case out of Montana. It is pretty straightforward, and that is the argument that was being made by those who won the case was if you're going to provide a scholarship for parents who want to use that for a private school, you can't prevent it from also allowing parents to use it for a Christian private school. And what was used against them is the so-called Blaine amendments. This was an attempt by actually an individual to try to add that amendment to the Constitution. It was sort of anti-Catholic at its core, but the Supreme Court, if nothing else, has given quite a victory for parental rights. Tell us more, if you might.
It was a huge victory for parental rights, indeed. The case is Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue. Most people didn't even know it was happening until it was decided. And it involves, as you mentioned, this Blaine Amendment, this kind of provision in Montana's Constitution and 36 others that was enacted in the late 1800s by kind of anti-immigrant, any religion but Protestant, which was the leading religion and, of course, dominated society in the late 1800s. Out of fear that people would use money to possibly allow their kids to go to a school, mostly in those days Catholic, that violated their beliefs and that they thought, frankly, undermined their ability to create a civil American society. And these things have been on the books, these prejudicial, some of the language behind them is actually pretty extraordinary when you read the history. But they've been on the books, and it's what actually has led to so many battles over educational choice and so many impediments to legislatures giving parents that choice of where to send their kids, including religious schools.
One of the people that we mention so often is Paul Clement, who I understand was the one that wrote your brief and made that case about the Blaine Amendment. And Kelly Shackelford, of course, is good friends with him and also is on the program with us. Matter of fact, he'll be on again this Friday. Was pointed out, here's a good example. You just got to watch out what you want to do. You know, Protestants at the time said, we'll just use this to prevent any money going to Catholic parochial schools. But then it's been like a boomerang coming back and used against Christian schools. And you would see that this was something that I think, if nothing else, illustrates why we should be paying attention to these issues of religious liberty and why we should be concerned about anybody's religious liberty, because it was, if nothing else, preventing the Espinoza family and a couple of others from having a scholarship that certainly would be used in a way to advance the education of children in the first place.
That's right. And Kendra Espinoza and other parents, when Montana did pass a very modest scholarship program, they joined, they found a way to use those monies to be able to support religious schooling. Kendra Espinoza herself had to work 2 jobs, even when she had the scholarship, and then to deny them that right to be able to use that based on the fact that the Montana Supreme Court said it went to a religious school and is prohibited by the Constitution, was exactly the opportunity that advocates for parental rights needed to have a case to take to the Supreme Court. Many were on their way. There are still some that are making their way through the courts. The Institute of Justice, IJ, they call it, IJ.org, fantastically took these parents' case to the court. And as you said, Paul Clement and many, many, many other people helped organizations like ours mount amicus briefs. And for those listeners, that simply means we made some arguments. And one of the arguments that former Solicitor General Clement made is that the Constitution protects parents' rights to direct the education of their children. That any attempt to use a Blaine Amendment to block parents directing the educational life of their children violates bedrock constitutional principles. Let's be honest. There have been opponents to parents using their monies to go to private schools for generations now, and they hide behind the separation of church and state. And that kind of separation was created not because we're saying religion should be one where and state the other. That is, we all know that. But the state does not sanction, support, or advance religion when a parent, by their independent choice, as a neutral party, uses tax dollars to go to religious school. And the justices have ruled this time and time again and validated again this year in the case that was decided on June 30th. It was fantastic to read the decision because what they basically said is, as they ruled in Zellman, which was the Ohio school choice case several years ago, a parent making that choice, again, the government is a neutral player. The government is not advancing Catholicism, Christianity, Judaism, anything, simply because they say, you know what, my tax monies can't go to this kind of school. I want to go here instead. So it's absolutely knock out of the park. And now what it means is we've got to go to every state where there's a Blaine Amendment and begin to unravel those and get new programs on the books that allow parents to choose, particularly in this day and age where schooling is so has so much uncertainty behind schooling for everyone.
As a matter of fact, after you go, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the arguments for actually having kids in school in the fall. But again, if your goal is the education of children, then it seems to me that oftentimes we find that students do better in private schools, Christian schools, charter schools. But if indeed you're worried about union representation, then you're kind of like the United Teachers Los Angeles Union that said, we're only going to open the schools if the police are disfunded and defunded, if we publicly eliminate charter schools, if we have Medicare for all, government-run health care, and if we actually implement another tax on the wealthy. That doesn't seem like they're really that concerned about the students. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A dead cat in Atlanta, Georgia was sent a voter registration form in the mail. That is unfortunate since only live dogs and cats should be registered to vote. I'm joking, but just barely. One journalist has documented that pets, some named Mozart and Scampers, have been receiving voter applications in Florida, Colorado, and Washington State. This is not a new phenomenon. Years ago, I had a commentary about all the false names used to register voters in a number of states. For example, the names of the entire starting line of the Dallas Cowboys was used to register people to vote in Nevada. And the addresses used in some of these fraudulent forms have been traced to restaurants and vacant lots. Now, the Georgia Secretary of State said that the voter application for Cody the cat did not come from their office. Third-party groups often use mailing lists to get names and addresses. But you can imagine what the cat's owner, Ron Timms, thought when he checked his mailbox and found a registration card for Cody Timms. He was a great cat and lived more than 18 years, but he did not need to register to vote, especially since he passed away some time ago. Obviously, I'm having some fun here, but the issue is serious. Mail-in ballots, along with massive voter registration mailings, have all the potential for misuse and abuse. Any person could take the voter registration application for the dead cat and fill it out with the necessary information. And when stacks of voter registration applications are dumped on the desk of local officials, they simply don't have the time to check all the names and addresses. Whoever decides to become Cody Timms could then show up with a voter registration card or even ask for a mail-in ballot. The next time someone tells you that voter fraud is a myth and that mail-in ballot elections are safe, just remember this story of a dead cat receiving a voter registration form. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue conversation for a few more minutes with Jeanne Allen, and if you'd like to know more about the Center for Education Reform, we have a link on our website, pointofview.net, or you can simply go to edreform.com, edreform.com, and I would encourage you to find out more, especially if you want to know how to improve your schools. And Jeanne, for just a minute, let's talk about, I mentioned the charter schools, and if for no other reason, we've been talking about this lately because of this new book out by Thomas Sowell, Charter Schools and Their Enemies. And as I go to your website, I see you have a couple of articles about that in terms of the existential union threat to charter schools. Charter schools don't need blood money. And it gets back to this issue because, sadly, there are a lot of children and their parents who, because of their zip code, where they're located, and maybe because of financial barriers, are stuck in chronically substandard schools. And yet these charter schools seem to do better, but they seem to be coming under such an attack from the teachers union and even the presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. What's your thoughts?
You know, it's really an extraordinary time, Kerby, because there is so much support across every conceivable traditional political socioeconomic divide, middle class, working class, low income, black, white, in between, every color, of people who recognize that parents should be the ones that decide how best to educate their kids. And charter schools started back in the early 90s. We now have 44 states, 45 states plus the District of Columbia that have laws. Some have lots and some have fewer, but they have become a critical viable opportunity outside of your zip code for so many parents, particularly because, as we talked about before the break, there's not a lot of private school choices that also allow you to use your tax dollars. We have some, but there's not like more than 3 million students in charter schools. And so what happens? Charter schools are public, open to parents by choice, still accountable for all the regular health, safety, civil rights, but not beholden to traditional districts and states for typical rules and regulations. So it means, what does it mean? Like most great American things, they're free and flexible to pivot on a dime, which is why charters and, in fact, many private schools are doing better under a challenge like COVID than most traditional public schools. And so it just makes so much more sense that we should have those options, and yet they are under attack relentlessly. As you mentioned, the Los Angeles Teachers Union, San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, you name it, wants these schools closed down. They've worked towards moratorium. Right now they're holding them hostage as part of a package about whether or not they'll go back to school in L.A. It's just ridiculous. Why? Because a few select minority voices in the union that lead a union, not teachers, don't want the competition, don't want to see the money that they can't control.
Well, again, a lot of it is about control. And frankly, if the public schools were doing so well, then I don't think we would necessarily see the contrast, but you do. And the National Assessment of Educational Progress, last time I looked at it, tell us that these kids that we supposedly just graduated from high school, and most of them didn't get to walk the aisle, which is kind of sad, but nevertheless,
so sad.
Only a third of these 12th graders tested proficient or better in reading, and only a fourth were proficient or better in math. So it isn't like we are producing just such a quality product right now out of the public schools, are we?
No, sadly, it's pretty much less than a third proficiency for any given subject, 4th, 8th, and 12th grade. And those numbers are dramatically worse even for our poor kids of color. In city to city, state to state. And so that doesn't mean public schools are bad. Let me just really clarify this for everybody. We have, it's really sad. We've created such large monopolistic organizations that superintendents often have nothing to do with whether education is going on or not. We give them a thankless job of basically telling them to run the equivalent of multinational corporations that is all government, and that they have to follow rules and regulations. So our superintendents, our principals, our teachers out there are victims of a system that is impervious to change, that doesn't let them do their job, that doesn't reward them when they do well, and when they don't do well, does nothing to move them along. And so it's when you do have great leaders in schools that do well despite the odds, and great teachers, which the majority of them are working their hearts out and are doing a great job, you just don't see the results as much because they have so little control about what happens next to their students, who goes to the next classroom, what the school is like, whether they're providing basic supports. And this is why also choice and competition is so essential. They're not just throwaway lines. It's because when there's more flexibility for schools, teachers have better jobs. Principals have more controls. Superintendents were supposed to be the people who help manage infrastructure, not manage government regulations that have been thrown on them year after year. And then where does the money go? The money goes to pay for compliance, not to pay for teachers. And so we are very pro-teacher, we are very pro-parent, we are very pro-student. Those are the only three things anyone should be. And when the system supports us, great. And if the system doesn't, we should send them packing and have another school to send our kids to.
Very good. And again, we recognize that the best of the best are still doing well. They are in the better zip codes. They have the better funding. The kids probably have access to everything from computers to tutors if necessary. But the real concern, especially since we've closed down these schools since March, is what happens when you are in the inner city. You don't have access to fast internet. You don't have a computer. It seems to me that I can at least understand why everything from the American Academy of Pediatrics, the article we've just posted here today, as well as the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine are saying we need to put the kids back in school because the ones that are going to be the hurt are the ones that are already disadvantaged right now.
Right. Although I will tell you, Kerby, not to burst people's bubbles out there, but even our best students are lagging behind other students in other countries, and even our best schools and best good coats have kids that are going to school that barely know history, don't ever really touch civics, where the demands for science and math pale in comparison to where they should be, which is why even A and B students end up getting to college and need remediation. So I think what's happening today, too, because of COVID, it is sad that it took a pandemic to show us this, that many parents are recognizing that even their schools that they thought were great are incapable, or let's say not incapable, I take that back, are under-trained and not expected to turn on a dime or be responsive. And that's what we need. We need responsive, parental-focused, student-centered schools, and we're not doing a great job in any sector.
Let me just encourage people to go to the Center for Education Reform and talk about this, because you have a COVID action series, you have various initiatives, news and analysis, and of course your podcast. So let's encourage people to go to the website, and Jeannie, talk about what they will find when they land there.
Yeah, I would love you to go to edreform.com, and there's all sorts of useful tools, a parent power index about how if you have power in your state and how to get it. The latest one will be unveiled in about 30 days. You can listen to Reality Check, my podcast. You can read articles. You can learn other groups that you can get involved with at the national or state level. And follow us on Twitter as well, at EdReform, or on Facebook, the Center for Education Reform.
And again, we have all those links to Facebook, Twitter, and of course the website on our website as well, edreform.com. And Jeannie, thank you for the work that you're doing. And again, I wanted to underscore more time how this Supreme Court decision is a step in the right direction. So hopefully we'll have some more like this. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll change topics, although let me encourage you to go to the website. You'll find some great material there. And if you'd like to know more about parental rights, that is the case. Michael O'Neill will be with us, and he is an individual that actually has filed a number of these briefs, amicus briefs, that before the Supreme Court, before the Commonwealth in Pennsylvania, California, a number of others, on this issue of vote by mail. And so we'll get into, is there some potential for voter fraud? And I think the answer is pretty obviously yes, as we've documented on this program. But he'll give us a little more of an understanding of some of those issues. And then once we're finished with him, in the next hour, we'll get into some of the articles we've posted. One by K. Cole James on it's more than toppling statues. It's about toppling America. And I've already mentioned just in passing, very good piece by Katie Pavlich on, again, this whole idea of school reopenings, which gives you some facts and figures and some very definite quotes from the American Academy of Pediatrics, National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Almost to a person, there are people that are absolutely convinced that we need to get kids back in school. There are some risks either way, but the risk of keeping them out is worse than getting them involved. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you've been listening to the program any length of time or even reading some of my commentaries, you know a real concern about the potential for voter fraud that comes from vote by mail. My April 30th commentary is one. The one July 6th is another. Even my commentary today about the voter registration form that was sent to a dead cat in Atlanta gets into that a little bit. We've had Hans von Spakowski on this program and a variety of other individuals who have raised some very significant concerns. And so what I wanted to do is give you a chance to understand a little bit more about some of the legal issues behind this. We've actually posted an amicus brief that comes from Landmark Legal and from my guest, Michael J. O'Neill, who serves as the Assistant General Counsel for Landmark Legal. He is a member of the Federalist Society, the American Bar Association, practices law in Virginia and the District, an individual that is a graduate of Villanova and Catholic University's Columbus School of Law. So, Michael, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. How are you?
I am good, and I am so thrilled that we could share some of this with our listeners, because when I find myself in any kind of discussion, verbal discussion, even more recently Facebook discussion, people saying, you know, we might have some problems with mail-in balloting, but we can solve all those. And I say, well, okay, how about looking at what's happened in New Jersey, or let's look at what's happened in other states in which we are starting to have pretty good concerns about the fact that there's no chain of custody. We don't know whether somebody was pressured. We don't even know if this ballot was filled out by that individual. Help us understand what you've been dealing with in terms of some of these legal issues right now.
Absolutely. First of all, I'd like to dispel the myth that's out there that vote by mail is perfectly safe and effective. Vote by mail is inherently vulnerable to voter fraud, and just by its very nature. And it's not Mike O'Neill or Landmark Legal Foundation who's reached that conclusion. You can read reports online by bipartisan commissions that have concluded that vote by mail is considerably more vulnerable to voter fraud than traditional voting. And now if you really think about how vote by mail works, it becomes obvious. As you just mentioned, first of all, chain of custody is a major issue with vote by mail. Think about it. A ballot is sent to you. It's put in your mailbox, and it could be put in your mailbox in the morning, and it could sit in your mailbox for hours before you come home from work to pick up that ballot, and multiply that by thousands or tens of thousands. So you could have thousands of ballots just sitting in mailboxes, open to anyone who wants to come and collect those ballots. Take those ballots, fill them out, and then send them in accordingly. So that's just by its nature, it's more vulnerable. Next, people who when you vote by mail, you're not subject. You don't have the same protections as when you vote in person. Now think about it. If you show up at your precinct to vote, there are many rules and laws that are in place to ensure that you're not subject to undue influence. And that's to preserve the integrity of the secret ballot. Now, hundreds of years ago, when you think about the party machines who used to control elections and used to control voting in large cities and other parts of the country, they could oftentimes stand over you and say, vote for Tammany or vote for whomever you want to have them vote for, and they would get you the number of votes you wanted to have. Now, what's evolved from that is the secret ballot, and that means you can vote free of influence or intimidation from absolutely anybody. And that's what's guaranteed when you vote in your precinct. You walk into your voting booth, you pull the curtain across, and you vote however you want to vote for. You can vote for Joe Biden, you can vote for Donald Trump, you can vote for whomever you want to vote for. You can vote for Mickey Mouse if that's who you want to do it, if that's how you want to vote. Now, what happens when you vote by mail? Oftentimes what happens is certain organizations use what is known as a ballot harvester. And these are individuals who are sometimes paid, sometimes aren't paid, to go around to neighborhoods of people who are voting by mail. Oftentimes happens in nursing homes or areas with other vulnerable populations. And they establish a relationship with the voter. They'll come a few weeks before the vote and might say, hey, come and vote for whomever, or I want to talk to you about the election. And on election day, they'll come around and they'll say, well, we'll help you out. We'll help you fill out your ballot. We'll do whatever you need to help you get through your ballot, to fill out your ballot.
There you go.
And think about those vulnerable people.
Yeah.
They can be subject to any kind of intimidation. Now, oftentimes people who work for candidates aren't allowed within 100 feet of the ballot precincts. Here, you can have whomever coming to your door, knocking on your door, saying, are you going to vote for this person? Are you going to vote for that person? Subjecting vulnerable people to all kinds of intimidation. So if you just think about the general nature of vote by mail, it is inherently vulnerable, and it's really rampant for the opportunities for fraud. I'd just like to talk to you really quickly about actual implementation of how this vote by mail is going to work. And if you think about it, if the left has its way, they're going to have widespread vote by mail in every state throughout the country. Going to have millions of people casting their vote by mail ballots this November. Well, just last week, the New York Times reported about and this is the New York Times I'm talking about here. This isn't Right Wing Magazine or Conservative Inc. or anything like that. This is the New York Times talking about all the problems that have occurred in a primary in the 12th congressional district in the state of New York. I'm just going to read to you just a quick second here. One of the candidates fighting for her political life, where only 800 of some 65,000 absentee ballots have been tabulated as of Wednesday, and this is 3 weeks after the election occurred. So you take that numbers and you multiply those by millions, and you think of all the problems we're going to have in this country if we have widespread vote by mail going on this November.
You know, one of the things I used is, of course, what happened in Paterson, New Jersey. I mentioned New Jersey just a minute ago. Third largest city in New Jersey. Had a city council election. They had 16,000 vote-by-mail ballots, but only 13,000 were counted, which means that more than 3,000 were disqualified for the Board of Elections because some were appearing in mailboxes improperly bundled. Some were disqualified because the signatures didn't match. And you start multiplying, like you said, that was just a city council election. You multiply that, like you said, by millions, and you see that we are no longer talking about the hypothetical possibility of fraud. We're talking about the very real prospects and examples of fraud, aren't we?
We are, and we could talk about fraud, and there's different levels here. We can talk about fraud. We could talk about disenfranchisement. We can talk about the system not having the ability to simply tabulate the ballots and have an accurate count of the ballots. The integrity of the election can actually be cast into doubt. Now think about it again. If city systems, state systems, voting systems don't have the infrastructure in place at this time to accurately count the millions of absentee ballots that could be cast if the left has its way. That's your floor. And then, of course, you're talking about all the various fraud that can occur with ballot harvesters, even in states, for example, like Texas, where we filed a brief just recently that you referenced, where ballot harvesting is prohibited. It still occurs. Oftentimes the left will say, well, these sorts of activities are illegal, and that's enough to prevent this sort of behavior from occurring. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Texas has some of the most stringent voting protections in place in the country, and yet we still found an example just in 2018 of ballot harvesting occurred, and the Attorney General received a criminal complaint referral from the Secretary of State to investigate ballot harvesting. So even in states where you have really strong voter laws to protect the integrity of the ballot and to prohibit ballot harvesting, it still occurs. So we're in for a tsunami of confusion at minimum, chaos at probable, if the left has its way and vote by mail is expanded to the entire country. What is important to note here is that states and localities can effectively implement in-person voting and put in place common sense measures to ensure that we are healthy and protected from the COVID virus. I don't think it's unreasonable for somebody to be concerned about the coronavirus or COVID-19 and raise legitimate concerns about this. But what we have seen in the state of Wisconsin, for example, and who conducted an in-person primary this spring, if the state or if the locality puts in place, again, these common sense protections, social distancing, cleaning, hand sanitizing, et cetera, people are going to be there's going to be no appreciable spike of transmissions from voting. transmission of COVID-19 from voting. So we can do in-person voting, as long as the necessary precautions are in place. And it is much more realistic to think that localities and states are going to be able to implement those common sense protections in in-person voting than to think that they're going to be able to somehow implement these systems that are going to be necessary to ensure vote by mail is safe and effective this November.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, continue our conversation with Michael O'Neill. And first of all, if you'd like to know about Landmark Legal, we have a link to that, so you can find out more about him and this outstanding organization. It's landmarklegal.org. But for those of you that would like to read a little bit, this vote by mail amicus brief, this one's for the Ninth Circuit Court. Of course, there's many others for the Supreme Court and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but it has a very good section here that talks about vote by mail requires special protections in order to prevent voter fraud. It's all on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
My Viewpoints commentary today is entitled Voter Registration. It's all the story about a dead cat in Atlanta, Georgia, that was sent a voter registration form. And again, you can imagine the cat's owner, Ron Timms, who said, our cat, Cody Timms, well, he lived 18 years, but we don't need to register and vote. He died a long time ago. And really, we should only have live dogs and cats be allowed to vote. At least that's what Senator Elizabeth Warren seemed to imply the other day when she said her dog Bailey is definitely going to vote in November. Bailey's voting Democrat all the way. Bailey for Biden. I'm having some fun with this, but you can see, Michael, that here's the potential. Okay, this shows up. Somebody else says, well, Cody Timms, I'll just become Cody Timms. I will fill all that out. And then I can show up with a voter registration card, or even better, I can just ask for a mail-in ballot. And at a time when we have, 378 counties in the country which have more voter registrations than there are citizens of voting age in those counties, there's a lot of potential for fraud, aren't there?
Absolutely, and that's a great point. What federal law requires, and is that states maintain accurate and up-to-date voter rolls. Now, that means that states, when somebody passes away or somebody moves out of state, it is incumbent upon the election officials in that state to remove the person from the voter roll. Well, like all bureaucratic institutions, that's not exactly done correctly. So what we have here are bloated voter rolls, and you indicated that there are a number of counties. There are hundreds of counties in the country with, that exceed the population of the county with the names on the voter rolls. And again, that's why. These efforts, when you hear politicians say things like every registered voter should receive an absentee ballot, and people like me, our heads explode. How can you send every registered name on a voter roll a ballot when the state or state election officials have done nothing to confirm the residency of those individuals? And then you get cases exactly like you get the cat. You get individuals who are 116 years old, ostensibly 116 years old, receiving ballots. You get people receiving multiple ballots. If you live part of the time in Florida, you'll get a ballot in Florida. Then if you live part of the time in Virginia, you'll get a ballot in Virginia. So essentially you'll have two vote-by-mail ballots. And it just creates confusion at best, confusion, fraud at worst. And it just unduly opens the election to all sorts of shenanigans that just boggle the mind. And what's important to note here is that citizens of our country have to have faith that our elections are held have faith in the integrity of the election process, and that the individuals that we elect to serve us in Congress or at any capacity are duly elected. And what happens when that faith is eroded? People stop voting. People stop having faith in the experiment of America, and we just start to go down a very dark road. Yeah. So what has to happen here going forward is states need to stand up to these left-wing organizations that are filing these just dozens of lawsuits, and do the right thing and stand strong, have faith in the integrity of their in-person voting system, defend the laws that they have on the books that have served them well. Those laws are such as limit who votes by mail. Now, again, just to talk about, for example, Texas. Texas has certain categories of individuals who can vote by mail, and those categories are, the traditional military, someone who's absent from the jurisdiction for work, or who's over 65, because they've noticed that elderly people sometimes need to have the vote by mail option because they might not be as mobile as other individuals. Now, those are reasonable laws. But again, removing those protections opens the vote by mail to everybody, and that's what the left wants to do for going into this election and then going forward. But those states that have strong laws need to stay strong going into this election season. They need to defend those laws, and they need to ensure the integrity of their election process.
Let's talk about the listeners that we have in places like Colorado, California, Oregon, Washington, Utah, others that already sort of have a vote by mail, either a de facto one or an actual one. Is there anything that our listeners in those states can do?
Well, there's a couple things. First of all, there are a couple states that have had vote by mail for a long time now, and you can distinguish those states right now from the states that are trying to scale up their vote by mail in the fact that they've had systems in place for years and have dedicated significant resources to attempting to ensure that vote by mail is relatively secure. Now, that's a state like Colorado or Oregon. Again, I would encourage those folks to put in, to mobilize to mobilize and to vote for individuals who want to go to traditional voting because it just is inherently more secure. Now, folks in California, that's a different story. California, if you'll recall,
yes.
In 2018, famous cases in Orange County, you remember that there were a number of traditionally Republican seats that flipped once a large number of vote-by-mail ballots were magically found and counted subsequent to the election day. Now, California has terrible laws, terrible state laws, no protection for the ballots, no ballot protections, and you see, widespread chaos in that state. And I don't. It's not hopeless because there are hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of individuals in California who are working very hard to ensure to restore the integrity of their process, and those individuals are to be commended for their hard work and tireless devotion to it. But what happened, again, I just want to turn your attention and your listeners' attention back to what happened in California as an example of the vote-by-mail problems, is in fact, you had one candidate who was elected a Republican in Orange County. She was assured of her election. She traveled to Washington, D.C. for freshman orientation in the United States House of Representatives. 2 weeks later, she was informed that she'd actually lost the election because 13,000 ballots had magically appeared. So if that didn't necessitate further investigation, I don't know what would. So again, I would encourage individuals in those states to stand strong, mobilize as many workers and voters as they can to advocate on behalf of these common sense solutions, and to vote for candidates who support these sorts of these ideals.
I would also encourage people to support landmarklegal.org because you are one of the few out there kind of fighting this issue. We've talked with John Fund and Hans von Spakowski and a couple of others, but again, we have filed and put one of your briefs on there so people can read a little bit more, and if they type in your name and look for some of the others, there are quite a number that you filed in different courts, and appreciate you standing there addressing this issue in the legal forum. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
My pleasure, Kerby. You have a great afternoon, and I hope everything, we'll keep our fingers crossed for going into the fall.
Again, Michael O'Neill, you want to know more about him, you want to know more about Landmark Legal, and we have that information on our website, pointofview.net. Let me just real quickly say that we have posted a number of very good articles on this subject over the last year or so on vote by mail, some having to do with legal decisions, one from Judge James Ho in the Fifth Circuit Court. That was in June. I mentioned one all the way back in April 30th, and then one more recently, July 6th. But even the one today, we got to talk about Cody the cat there. Here is a cat that has been dead and gets a voter registration form. And if that doesn't make you a little concerned, I don't know what does. And of course, my case out of Patterson, New Jersey. Great illustration. City council election, even the NAACP thought maybe they should disqualify the entire election. So these are some issues that really need to be addressed, and we will continue to address them here on Point of View. We come back, though, we'll talk about is the toppling of these statues more than it appears? What's happening up there in Portland? Now, 50 days of protests and riots and actions. The burning down of some churches that we'll talk about as well. And then we'll spend some time talking with our good friend, Dr. Paul Barreca with Fellowship International Mission. So we've got a lot to cover. We will do that right after these important messages.
"2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about the tearing down of these statues and what that might mean. We'll talk about some of the conflict taking place up there in Portland, 50 days of protest and sometimes riots that have been taking place. Also, the burning down of some churches, and, of course, some pretty good evidence that if you want to follow the science, we need to reopen the schools. That's what we'll cover in this first half hour. Then we'll spend some time talking with our good friend, Dr. Paul Barreca, Director of Fellowship International Mission. We'll talk about some of the mission activity. We'll also announce another trip that we're going to take next year, spring of 2021, to Israel, in case you'd like to join us there. And then we'll get into his very well-written piece on social action and the gospel. So we'll get into all of that this hour. And at any point you'll want to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. First piece that we have posted here is by Kay Cole James, an individual that is the president of the Heritage Foundation, an African-American woman who served in the Reagan administration. And she said, let me get straight to the point. It's time for bold action. She says it's time for Americans everywhere who love this country to heed the words of President Ronald Reagan, who said, if we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And she talks about how these violent mobs have defaced and torn down statues across the country in the name of social justice, something we'll get into a little bit later with Dr. Paul Barreca. Yet they've gone beyond toppling the statues of slave owners and Confederates to toppling statues of, like, the former slave Frederick Douglass we talked about the other day, one of the nation's great abolitionists who dedicated his life to ending slavery and promoting justice for African Americans. And so she says, it's become clear that it matters little to the Marxists and anarchists what a statue or monument represents. All that matters to them is that it represents America's past, and therefore it must come down. She said it's also clear they're not interested in resolving race issues. Destroying monuments, burning churches, looting businesses do nothing to bring attention to racism or advance police reforms. They're simply using racial discontent to forward their Marxist agenda. And then points out that, what has been the response? And I'll just give you this one. She said, after rioters in Baltimore recently tore down a statue of Christopher Columbus and tossed it into the harbor, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, a Baltimore native, her family grew up there in Baltimore, you might know, excused the behavior, telling reporters, well, people do what people do. And so she points out that, we have built statues and memorials to recognize individuals and events representing some of the noblest and even some of the worst moments in our history. The people memorialized didn't lead perfect lives. Many did controversial, even evil things, but the monuments help tell our history, help us remember our highest ideals as well as the mistakes we've made and wish not to repeat again. But she said if politicians ignore or even tacitly encourage these mobs, they will declare more and more things offensive until they've targeted every founding father, every religious institution, and virtually any symbol of what they call oppressive Western civilization. And she says we must put an end to this now. The rioters and statue topplers must be arrested and prosecuted. By the way, some are. We must educate the public about the truth of the founding of the most exceptional nation on earth, and we must wrest our educational system from the hands of leftists who use our schools as indoctrination centers before we lose yet another generation to them. She goes and writes a lot more than that. I just gave you some of the highlights that I thought were most appropriate as a way to get into a very concrete example. Last Friday, we could have talked about Portland. At that time, you had 47 consecutive days of protest. But now it's in the news because finally, Homeland Security decided to send in some people to deal with what apparently the Portland police, the Portland mayor, and the governor of Oregon did not want to deal with. But before you get into the criticism that has been leveled at the president from various sitting senators and from the mayor and from the governor, maybe you just need to remember a little bit of the timeline here, and that will give you a better understanding why finally the federal government said we have to step in. I'll just pick a couple of key dates here. May 29th, rioters broke through a front window and painted graffiti on the Mark Hatfield Courthouse in Portland, causing $5,000 of damage, according to the Department of Homeland Security. Next day, demonstrators identifying with Antifa and Black Lives Matter movement to face several other buildings, including the Hatfield Courthouse and the Edith Green Wendell Wyatt Federal Building. Over the next several days, vandals spray painted these federal buildings along with numerous other local government buildings. June 6th, they'll jump ahead. Rioters destroyed fencing that was put up around the federal property. The next night, they breached the fence, broke more windows, cut a hole in the fence. By June 11th, they had completely dismantled the fence around the Green Wyatt building. By the way, these are federal buildings, by the way. Several more nights of vandalism. June 20th, a crowd of about 400 used commercial-grade lasers to try to cause eye damage to police officers. June 30th, rioters ripped off the plywood covering the windows of the Green Wyatt building, then proceeded to break windows in the two federal buildings. June 2nd, rioters refused to vacate an area of the Hatfield Courthouse. They launched fireworks through objects at police officers, used lasers to cause eye damage. If you want to know what those objects were, I've got them right here. This is from the Sheriff Department of Multnomah County. You know, they always say, well, they were just throwing some water bottles. Oh, no, these are bricks, glass bottles, blades, ball bearings, mortars, batteries. At high speeds, these can be very deadly, and so this was something that was happening when they were trying to protect people inside the Justice Department. Of course, maybe jump ahead. Let's go to July 7th. That was the so-called Night of Rage, where you had a mob of over 500 that assaulted law enforcement officers with rocks and bottles and those kinds of things. July 8th, the next day, another 200. You can kind of get the idea. And so finally, after all of this time, when it seemed like the mayor and the police and even the governor were impotent, the president said, okay, we will then empower the Department of Homeland Security to go in. They have come in, as you may have seen, because now this is so controversial. No one even probably knew what was happening in Portland until all of a sudden now we're hearing from the Senators Jeff Merkley and Ron Wyden, as well as the governor and the mayor and everybody else, complaining about the fact that they've made the matters worse. You need to just go out. And don't believe us, just go out there right now to Portland. Use your Google search, Portland riots, Portland vandalism, and you will see that some of these buildings look like a third world country. You can watch some of the videos and see some of the anarchists there destroying federal property. And so the criticism now is these individuals show up, but they're not in marked cars. They're in rental cars. They have camouflage on. It does say police, but the ACLU and some of the civil libertarians said, well, this looks like something you might see in a third world country. And I recognize there are some concerns about that. But just imagine if you showed up in a federal car with a uniform, what would happen there? And so they have been trying to identify some of those individuals through facial recognition. Then when they are violating the law, many times just after curfew, they're able to take them and investigate what has been taking place. A lot more to say about this, but it's an illustration of if you really want to understand what's going on, read more than just what you see in your local newspaper. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A dead cat in Atlanta, Georgia was sent a voter registration form in the mail. That is unfortunate since only live dogs and cats should be registered to vote. I'm joking, but just barely. One journalist has documented that pets, some named Mozart and Scampers, have been receiving voter applications in Florida, Colorado, and Washington State. This is not a new phenomenon. Years ago, I had a commentary about all the false names used to register voters in a number of states. For example, the names of the entire starting line of the Dallas Cowboys was used to register people to vote in Nevada. And the addresses used in some of these fraudulent forms have been traced to restaurants and vacant lots. Now, the Georgia Secretary of State said that the voter application for Cody the cat did not come from their office. Third-party groups often use mailing lists to get names and addresses. But you can imagine what the cat's owner, Ron Timms, thought when he checked his mailbox and found a registration card for Cody Timms. He was a great cat and lived more than 18 years, but he did not need to register to vote, especially since he passed away some time ago. Obviously, I'm having some fun here, but the issue is serious. Mail-in ballots, along with massive voter registration mailings, have all the potential for misuse and abuse. Any person could take the voter registration application for the dead cat and fill it out with the necessary information. And when stacks of voter registration applications are dumped on the desk of local officials, they simply don't have the time to check all the names and addresses. Whoever decides to become Cody Timms could then show up with a voter registration card or even ask for a mail-in ballot. The next time someone tells you that voter fraud is a myth and that mail-in ballot elections are safe, just remember this story of a dead cat receiving a voter registration form. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Likewise, again, let me, if I can, for just a minute, talk about some other things that aren't being covered. You probably didn't even know what was happening in Portland, maybe until I just said this, but maybe not until the news media said, well, this is now controversial because the federal government's getting involved. But here's another one. I've had a number of people say, I did not know that churches were being burned around the country unless I read it maybe in Jim Dennison's daily article. By the way, Jim Dennison was with us last Monday, and if you don't get his daily article, very good. Tony Perkins has written about it this way. He said over the weekend, and he's looking at the previous weekend, he said rioters and the same ones who wanted us to believe their cause is justice came for our churches, using gasoline, lighters, gallons of paint, and vans to drive their message of destruction and chaos through the heart of Americans faithful. He said it took more than 50 firefighters to put out the mountain of flames in San Gabriel Church, which by Saturday night, that was the week before, was nothing but a rickety frame of smoldering ash. He said while Californians watched helplessly as a town symbol burned, congregants in Florida's Queen of Peace Catholic Church were praying in the sanctuary when they heard a car crash through the foyer. Seconds later came the smell of smoke clouding the entry. By the way, here's the reaction from one of the arsonists, laughing about it later with police. A 23-year-old arsonist said he was on a mission. Turns out it was a mission several radicals shared as a wave of destruction hit as many as 5 more churches in 48 hours. Even historically black congregations were targets. I'm thinking in this case of Calvary Baptist in San Diego. Watch its building for children's ministry burn to the ground after a suspicious blaze started in the attic. You can go to New York City. The mobs there set bonfires of 2 Virgin Mary statues, as well as even a sculpture of Jesus was decapitated, and that picture has made the rounds on Facebook, so you've probably seen it as well. So Tony Perkins tries to answer the question that many people ask. He said, if you want to know why the mainstream media isn't covering these attacks, and many have wondered, it's no secret. They don't want to expose this movement for what it is, a sham of racial equality and a revolt against the rule of law rooted in the transcendent truth of God. He goes through and gives a lot more information, but I just thought I would mention it because I've run into a number of people that were completely unaware that a number of churches have been torched. And when you look at some of those pictures, it looks like pictures maybe out of the actions of ISIS over there in Iraq. But nevertheless, let's get to one of the other articles that I've posted here. Then we'll spend some time talking with Dr. Paul Barreca. This article comes from Katie Pavlich. Democrats reject the science of school openings. And she quotes from a number, but just in the interest of time, maybe I'll just read from the American Academy of Pediatrics. On Friday, I did mention that there was a very good piece, which I erroneously said was on CNN. It turned out it was on NBC, but it was where they were going and interviewing by Zoom a variety of different pediatricians, many of whom were with the American Academy of Pediatrics. And to a person, they all said, well, I'm going to send my kids to school. This is fine. This is safe for them. And then they come back to the host who's kind of like, shell-shocked, didn't expect that kind of answer. And so this is what we are seeing right now from people who probably would, again, trust the science. The American Academy of Pediatrics put it this way. The importance of in-person learning is well documented, and there is already evidence of the negative impacts on children because of school closures in the spring of 2020. They say lengthy time away from school and associated interruption of supportive services often results in social isolation, making it difficult for schools to identify and address important learning deficits, as well as child and adolescent physical or sexual abuse, substance use, depression, and suicidal ideation. The group, which represents thousands of pediatricians around the country, released in the statement, they said this in turn places children and adolescents at considerable risk of morbidity and in some cases mortality. Beyond the educational impact and social impact of school closures, there have been substantial impact on food security and physical activity for children and families. Michael Reagan put it this way. He started his piece, Michael Reagan, by the way, the adopted son of Ronald Reagan, and he asked 3 questions. See if you agree with these. Question number 1, can we all agree that children living in the biggest cities don't get a good education? Yeah, I think we've already been talking about that with Jeanne Allen, haven't we? Number 2, can we all agree that it's a travesty that upwards 95% of the kids in the inner city schools aren't able to read, write, or count at grade level? I've given you those numbers before as well. And number 3, can we all agree that if we don't open our schools this fall, the group that will be hurt the most are the poor kids of every color in our inner cities? I think we'd agree with that. So he said, I'm glad we all agree, and points out, as many of us have, that you can go to Germany, you can go to many countries in Europe, you can go to Australia and others, in which you actually see the kids in school right now. And so we're all saying whether we're going to send them to school. And he points out a little bit later that, you know, if you're affluent and you're one of the elites in Manhattan, you're living in Washington, D.C. and making a good income, or maybe you're in Beverly Hills or Silicon Valley, yeah, your kids, you know, they already have all sorts of benefits. They can certainly be sent to private schools, or even if they're supposedly learning at home, they can get tutors. They have computers, they have whiteboards, they have fast internet. But guess what? That's not happening to kids in the inner city. And again, some of them are in situations where just getting a meal to them is so essential because they have been fed both at breakfast and at lunch at school. So these are some very important issues that sometimes when we have this debate about reopening the schools simply don't get mentioned. Okay, let's end with at least some positives, and then we'll spend some time with Dr. Paul Barreca. And that is, we have some great news about some of these vaccines. The other day, I talked about the vaccine from Moderna. Moderna is developing and has developed what's called an RNA vaccine, which is a little bit different. And as a result, that is located in Boston area. And the new results published by the New England Journal of Medicine show that the vaccine induced the desired immune response in all 45 people. And then now they're going to a larger group to make sure that it's safe and well tolerated. That one we announced the other day, I think on Wednesday. Now we have the newest announcement from AstraZeneca. Oxford University, working with AstraZeneca, have actually administered a trial that involved 1,000 people, and it caused an immune reaction. This one now, by the way, is a viral vaccine, a little bit different than the RNA vaccine that has been dealt with. And, of course, there's also some developing what's called an antigen vaccine. I won't get into all those details, but you can go to my June 17th commentary if you'd like to know a little bit more about some of these vaccines. But, of course, the big question I've always asked is, will that many Americans be willing to be vaccinated? The most recent poll shows only about half of the country might take the vaccine. But now that we know a little bit more about so-called herd immunity, that might be enough. We used to think herd immunity took place at 70% of the population. There's some people suggesting maybe it takes place at 20%. So maybe with those who have already had COVID-19, either with severe or less severe situations where they have some antibodies, we might eventually reach what is called herd immunity. I hate the term, but that's what it's called. Just before we take a break, though, one thing that is interesting is we now recognize that there are 6 distinct types of coronavirus, and the scientists at King's College there in London have been using what's called a symptom tracker. And people that have the first particular type of coronavirus compared to those who have the 6th type of the coronavirus, very different. Patients with the 6th type of COVID-19 are nearly 10 times more likely to end up needing breathing support than patients in the first group. So in some respects, you better hope that you get the mild version of COVID-19, because the severe one probably will put you into an ICU. Not that much, even so, even for the worst, 19.8%. But again, if you have other kind of mitigating factors, that could be certainly the case. So if nothing else, just wanted to give you some news about the progress on a vaccine. Again, they're rushing it. We know it's rushed. And will it be available by the end of the year or early next year? Maybe. Will it be safe? Well, that's going to be a question we'll have to ask when we go further down the line. But let's take a break. We come back, we'll have some time with our friend Dr. Paul Barreca, talk about what's happening in missions, what we have planned for our next Israel trip, and maybe talk a little bit about his paper on social action, the social gospel, and some of these virtue warriors and all of the rest. So we'll get into all those topics, but we need to take a break. And you can find all of the information I've been talking about on our website, pointofview.net.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
We now bring to the microphone Dr. Paul Barreca. He is the director of Fellowship International Mission. The name is probably familiar because he has been with me, and we have partnered over the years to do a number of trips to Israel. We have another one coming up in 2021 we'll talk about in just a minute. So in addition, of course, to missions, he has been a pastor for 33 years and is now really bringing this kind of mission focus internationally. He has really been working on the area of discipleship, and we've talked in the past about his book, Follow the Master, How Jesus Made Disciples. Graduate of a Word of Life Bible Institute, Lancaster Bible College, Michigan Theological Seminary, and Clark Summit University, where he earned a Doctor of Ministry. And Dr. Paul Barreca, always great to have you on the program with us.
Thank you, Kerby. Great to talk to you today from Pennsylvania to Texas.
Yes.
Wonderful connection.
Let's, if we can, talk about the fact that, of course, COVID-19 has slowed you down a little bit, and you haven't been able to travel as much. But talk about the impact that that's having for missionaries worldwide. We've talked about this with a couple of mission organizations, but I'd like to know how this pandemic has affected mission activity for the missionaries that you support.
That's a great question, Kerby, because, we're involved in the news cycle. We're watching things constantly, so it's whether it's coronavirus, and of course that moved into George Floyd and protests and cities and defund the police and so many issues. It's almost like we're just struggling to keep our heads above water. And we're kind of focused on America and what's happening in America with coronavirus and all of these types of things. I think sometimes we forget that the whole world is going through this. And while in the United States we've got lots of resources, people in much poorer countries don't have those resources, and the effects of of quarantines and lockdowns in those countries are so much more severe than they are here. No one's, in countries in South America and Africa and Asia, the Middle East, people aren't getting $1,200 checks, from the government. They're not getting, 12 weeks of unemployment. They don't have access to food pantries and so many of the types of resources that we have here in America. So one little story comes from one of our missionaries. When the government in a poor country says you have to stay home and can't go to work, this is a person that would typically go to work on Monday, get paid at the end of the day, stop and buy some rice and vegetables on the way home to eat that night. And so we've been trying to address some of these needs, and many other mission agencies have been doing the same thing. And we've established a fund for food, and our folks have been able to do that. And the response has just been positive and overwhelming, and we just see God doing amazing things through the generosity of people here in the U.S.
Let me just mention that we have a link to Fellowship International Mission. It's FIM.org. As we've talked with some others who have had different outreaches in various places, have wanted to give people a chance to give, so that even though for many of us the pandemic or even the lockdowns have been an inconvenience, and for some very devastating if you've lost your job, when you go to third world countries, many of the places where your missionaries actually minister, Paul, there is an incredible need. So as people go to the website, you've got some encouraging words about what is taking place, but how can they maybe help you in one way or another advance the gospel and meet some of those very significant needs?
So one way they can do that is to search on the giving portion of FIM.org. And if you just type in the search bar the word coronavirus, you'll find the Coronavirus International Relief Fund. And what we're doing is we're giving those funds directly to our missionaries who are able to purchase food, and they're doing it directly. For example, I'm looking at a newsletter from one of our missionaries in Mexico who took some of those funds and helped 60 families with just a few $100s. And it's kind of hard to believe that we could help that many. And he responds and writes that over 3/4 of those 60 received Bible studies, and they're receiving a Bible. he talks about the impact of this, not just helping people that are hungry, but their men's Bible studies, their women's Bible studies have both doubled in size. People are coming, they're asking questions, and they're responding to not only the kindness and the generosity that's helped their families, but also to the gospel message. Another from India, we were able to help a missionary from India with just $500. He was able to help 20 families buy enough food for each of those families for 2 months. Enough. Now the food means a bag of rice, but that is enough to sustain them, and then to share with them the good news of the gospel. So lots of agencies have had this, and I just find the generosity of God's people so encouraging. And we have been concerned that, with people losing work and unemployment, that giving would decrease. And for some it has. We've had some people that have had to end their monthly support of a missionary, but it's been relatively small. And the generosity of God's people has just been so amazing. We don't have, in our mission, we don't have any missionaries that have had to come home from their field because they don't have any more support from their U.S. donors. And God's people have really responded in a powerful way. So there's some good news for today. I know we've listening a little bit. There's so much that we can talk about, and there's a lot of discouraging things out there. But the response of God's people is really amazing.
I think so, too. Let's, if we can, talk about one country that I know you want to address, and that is Nigeria, because of the persecution of Christians. And this is, again, one of those countries in the top 20, actually in the top 15, where there is a great deal of persecution. And, of course, you and I have friends that have actually gone there to be missionaries. But what is it like right there in Nigeria in particular?
Well, in a place that I was at just a year ago in Kaduna State in Nigeria, I just received a report that on Sunday, 19 were killed in a Fulani attack against what was perceived as a Christian village. This is going on all over Nigeria. It's very little reported on because it's predominantly Muslim-initiated violence. The Fulani are a nomadic Muslim tribe. And the violence that's occurring right now, those 19 people, that's occurring about 10 miles from an Ekwa seminary. That's an evangelical church in Nigeria. And there's hundreds, literally hundreds of students there that are they're hearing gunshots at night, and they don't know if the police are either able or prepared or willing to protect them. And so this is very serious, not talked about much, and there is a tremendous persecution of Christians taking place in Nigeria. I think on the Point of View website, we may have a link to a very interesting and moving video from the Samaritan's Purse. I'm sorry, not the Samaritan's Purse.
Voice of the Martyrs, yeah.
Voice of the Martyrs in Canada. And they've got a powerful video on what's happening in Nigeria. And so just to be praying for our believers and for the church here is, again, we're focused on the U.S., and rightly so. This is a very tumultuous time. But it is around the world, and our brothers and sisters need our prayers.
And again, let me just mention that is the last article there, and it is actually from our friends at Voice of the Martyrs. It's about 13 minutes long, and a parental advisory. There's a few things that might be a little scary there, but it does help you understand exactly what's happening there with the Fulani militants. Of course, you have Boko Haram and a number of others, so this is just one of those hot spots where various Muslim groups are seeking out and killing or persecuting, depending on what you might be running into, Christians there. So I just wanted you to be aware of that, and that is an article that we have posted there. And when we come back, I thought we might spend some time talking about your piece on social action and the gospel. It is actually a paper that you presented on the integral mission, is social action part of the gospel? And even before we go to a break, I guess we can all say, well, we just talked about how we need to do social good, and we need to oftentimes feed hungry stomachs before you can feed hungry hearts. But at the same time, are there individuals that now are spending more and more time in relief and development and less time in evangelism and discipleship. So those are some things that we want to talk about and are very well documented in this paper, which is about 20 pages long. So I want to encourage you, if you have not obtained this copy of the paper by Dr. Paul Barreca, you might want to, first of all, print it out, read it, maybe even pass it on to people inside your church, because if indeed we are convinced that the ultimate answer to every problem we talk about here at Point of View is the preaching of the gospel, that seems to be declining, and there are individuals that are starting to say, well, I'll just dig a water well, I'll just provide food, but I won't share the gospel. And that, I think, is why we want to come back and talk about that in some detail. So again, that's another one of the articles we posted on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Paul Barreca right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, Dr. Paul Barreca with us, and one of the things we have posted is his piece on integral mission, is social action part of the gospel. And Paul, you might just spend a little bit of time, if nothing else, explaining what integral mission is, because this is an attempt, I think, by some to say, well, we'll do evangelism by doing good works, but that is something that you are a little bit concerned about, aren't you?
Yeah, it sure is, and it's interesting that, so much of our attention on current events is tied into social justice right now. Integral mission is kind of the mission side of the social justice question, and integral mission says that the gospel includes, the gospel is a two-part gospel. It's one part is the message we proclaim and, evangelizing and telling people about Jesus. But the other part is doing good. It kind of conflates the Great Commandment and the Great Commission together. And the problem I have with that is that in the New Testament, the preaching of the gospel is never described in that way. It is just simply proclaiming and preaching the gospel. And so, in fact, I had not heard of the term integral mission. I'd been a pastor for over 30 years and became involved in a mission agency and now the director of Fellowship International Mission. And I started hearing this term, and I had to do a lot of research on it. It's been around for a while, but it is very predominant today. And I did not think a little less than a year ago, basically last fall, when I was presenting this paper and doing all of this research, that the social justice issue would become as large of an issue as it is today. And Kerby, you know how often we hear the phrase, generals are always fighting the last war.
Yes.
I think that in some degree, sometimes as Christians, we're guilty of that. And so we may be thinking about issues about perhaps legalism in the church or worship wars in the church or a particular theological issue. I think those are yesterday's wars. And I think 10 or 15 years from now, we're going to look back at this time and we're going to realize that the question of social justice and the gospel was really the defining issue for the church in 2020 to be dealing with. And I see it taking place in the church as many Christians and many seminaries and pastors and church leaders are embracing the social justice mantra, which really comes from a Marxist ideology. And in the integral mission, the interesting thing is that there is something similar. It is also linked to Marxist ideology because the foundation or the background of integral mission is liberation theology, which came to us from Central America, which is kind of the blending of Roman Catholicism and Marxism. So the mission side of this, I know at Point of View, a lot of your, and I appreciate so much your commentary and many guests that you have focusing on this question of social justice, but there's a companion part of that very closely related, which is this idea of integral mission.
Yes, and I might just point out that there's a chart which people can find as they go through your paper, and that particular chart on page 8 shows dramatically how in a lot of these mission agencies and organizations, the emphasis upon evangelism and discipleship has decreased by as much as 22%, while the increase in relief and development education has increased about 10%. So it is, first of all, something that I wanted to address not only just kind of philosophically, but practically, because for our listeners out there, they might say, well, we're supporting these missionaries, but it doesn't seem like they're really proclaiming the gospel. Now, I recognize that right now, because of the pandemic, a lot of mission activity has been pulled back, but this preceded the pandemic and will continue afterwards even more so if indeed the focus always is on providing food. As important as that is, the proclaiming of the gospel is something that we necessarily need. And so I'm really encouraging people that are maybe wondering about what the mission organizations that their church are funding or the missionaries they're funding, maybe to get a copy of your paper and learn a little bit more about this trend, because it's actually, if you think about it, something we dealt with at the turn of the last century, because you had the fundamentalist modernist controversy. And in some respects, we find ourselves today having a lot of the so-called evangelical organizations and mission organizations kind of buying into the wrong model. So it's just a great paper. But I thought just before we run out of time, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the fact that we will be having another trip to Israel, and that will be taking place in the late spring of 2021, and at least we hope by that time we'll be able to travel to Israel once again. And this has just been a great opportunity to partner with you and to go and give more and more of our listeners a chance to actually walk where Jesus walked.
That's right. The exact dates, Kerby, are June 7 through 17, 2021. And we're so excited because, by that time, I think all of us are going to be very, very anxious to do something fun and get out and do some travel, and we're really hoping and praying that certainly by then travel will be possible. Right now, Israel is closed to travel, and with being such a tourist destination, you could understand why. They have to protect their population, but by next spring, we are really looking forward to a dynamite trip with an amazing tour guide that has become a very dear friend both to you and me. One of the preeminent tour guides, really the one that most large, well-known speakers in the U.S. Get Jeremy for their tour guide, and he's done a great job for us. So we hope to have that brochure out, within a few weeks. Things regarding Israel are just as all other tourist type of issues right now, very, very suspended and up in the air, but we're hoping shortly to be able to get a brochure out to those who would like more information.
Right. Again, we wanted to make that available to you. There have been a number of you over the years that have traveled with us, and you may know some individuals that would like to be there. We try to just be in one bus and spend our time with Jeremy, who is just kind of one of the best around. That's why we have that particular date. And we're hoping that that will be far enough out that any of the concerns about COVID-19 will evaporate, and you'll be able to join us. And if not, well, we'll see what we can do in the future. But it's just been something that has been fun to partner with you. But let's, if we can, talk about some of the resources. First of all, we've posted this particular article, which I've entitled Social Action and the Gospel. And the whole social justice issue is important. Then we also have a link to your website, fim.org. And if some people would like to help your missionaries provide food or resources for people in their sphere of influence, how can they do so?
Go to that website and just type in the search bar coronavirus, and that will take you to the coronavirus giving page, and 100% of all of that funds, if you give $100, $100 will go and literally put food in the hand of someone in a foreign country. This is not for U.S. We have some missionaries in the U.S. This is exclusively for outside the U.S.
And again, for people that might be interested in doing missions, one of the things I've always appreciated about Fellowship International Mission is sometimes people have this great vision that God has given them, and then they take it to a typical mission organization. They go, well, that just doesn't fit what we do. And in some respects, you have been so adaptable as to really follow the leading that individuals have from the Lord. So if you are thinking about missions, I hope that you'll take the time to contact fim.org and find out a little bit more. Dr. Paul Barreca, always great to have you on the program. I'm looking forward to next time we can do some of this in studio, but it's just been great to talk to you by phone today, and thank you for joining us today on Point of View.
God bless you, Kerby. Thanks so much.
I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. And tomorrow we have lots to cover, as if we didn't cover a lot today. Oh, my goodness. We have a lot more to cover tomorrow, and we will do so. So I hope you will go to the website, pointofview.net, find some of the articles. We've talked with Michael O'Neill, Jeanne Allen, and, of course, Paul Barreca, and all of that information is at our website at Point of View. Well, let's take a break, and we'll see you back tomorrow on Tuesday right here on Point of View.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.